Good afternoon and welcome to another Launch Awesome AMA. I'm Steve. I run the Launch Awesome community, and today I'm joined by Justin Gallagher. Justin is the former head of product at Trello and now is the CPO at Hoop, which is a startup that gives teams the tools and workflow they need to kind of make decisions asynchronously. Today, Justin and I are going to be talking about his experience building a remote team at Trello and how product teams can kind of work better together in a remote environment by adopting a more asynchronous approach to making decisions, giving status updates, giving feedback, those kinds of things. If this is your first time joining us, Launch Awesome is a Slack community for product leaders to connect and learn and really just help each other build and launch great products. We have almost 500 of the best in product and product marketing in there now. So if you want to join, Blake is going to drop a link in the chat. We'd love to see you in there. And if you, at any point, as we're kind of talking through these things, if anything's coming up for you, any questions, comments, feel free to kind of drop your thoughts in the chat. There's also, let me make sure it's enabled. I know there's like a Q&A. Yeah. Turning this on now. Cool. On the bottom right, you should see a little kind of Q&A widget as well. So if you have questions, we are going to be doing some Q&A stuff at the end. So yeah, drop those in there. And with that, yeah, let's get into it. Justin, welcome.
Good.
And thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. Just really quick, set the scene. Give us like the 2-minute highlight reel of your career so far, just so people kind of have an idea of where you're coming from.
Sure. Let's see where to begin. I studied computer science in school, in college, kind of by accident. I actually went there to study geology, ended up switching to computer science because I
I
took
didn't
a
know that.
course as an elective and I thought it was really cool.
Yeah.
Coming out of school, I didn't really know what to do. Ended up going to consulting and worked at a big consulting firm for about 7 years, which was
Uh-huh.
a great way to start my career because I learned a lot just about working with people and projects and project management and people management and all kinds of other things. But ultimately decided that wasn't for me. And I always had a little bit of an entrepreneurial bug in me and wanted to kind of be more in startups and tech and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So spent some time trying to get over there. Wasn't the easiest jump to make at the time. Had a lot of interviews where they did not think my big consulting experience was going to transfer to startups, but
Hmm.
eventually was lucky to get a job at Fog Creek Software in New York City in
Hmm.
2010. And I joined there as a product manager and started working on Stack Exchange Enterprise, which was the enterprise version of Stack Overflow, which went through a lot of iterations. But Stack Overflow had spun out of Fog Creek previously. So, and lucky timing for me, about 6 months later, Fog Creek was kind of in this transition period, trying to come up with kind of the next product and new things. And we had these internal innovation sort of efforts that we were going through. And I ended up working on this idea for like kind of this lightweight project management thing. It was not really my idea. It came really from Joel, one of the founders, but worked on it with another guy, Bobby Grace, and seemed kind of cool. And we spent more time on it. We got a couple other engineers to join us a couple weeks later. And long story short, that turned into Trello. So spent 11 years working on Trello, did all kinds of different stuff. In those early days when you're a tiny team, you do everything.
Yes.
I was doing design work. I wrote the first version of the iPhone app,
No way.
a bunch of other stuff. But ultimately, as probably the worst engineer and worst designer on the team, settled into product management, and that was a good fit for me. I really liked it. And
Yeah.
so did that. Ended up running product and design at Trello up until we were acquired by Atlassian in 2017. Stayed for 5 years at Atlassian, continuing to run product for Trello, and then back in the spring, left on to new adventures and founded a company called Hoop with two of my former colleagues, Stella Garber and Brian Schmidt. And we're out there trying to make async work and remote work better for teams by helping them make better decisions faster without meetings.
Yes. Love that. Yeah. Okay. So to that end, Trello was one of the earlier companies to have a pretty significant remote set of employees.
Yeah.
It wasn't very common at all
Hmm.
not that long ago, which is kind of funny to think
Yeah.
how quickly things have changed. Talk to
Hmm.
me, what was that experience like being one of the first companies kind of foraying into that?
Yeah, there were a few. Like, I don't want to take credit
Mhm.
for being the first. There was
Sure.
definitely some companies doing it, but it was certainly not the level that we see today.
Yeah.
We sort of did it almost by accident, to be honest. We had an office in New York
Mhm.
City. Everybody was in the office. One of our longtime, really great developers, Brett, was from Hawaii and he wanted to move back home to be closer to family. And so he sort of
Mhm.
pitched it to the team and the company as like, we'll try this for a year, we'll see if it works, and worst comes to worst, to come back. And we didn't want to lose him he
Yeah.
was a great key person on the team, so we thought we'd
Yeah.
try it, and it worked okay. And so it was so competitive, as always, hiring for engineers back then, that we thought, hey, maybe we could hire other engineers remotely, and this would be great. We could hire people in other markets that don't have cool companies to work for right in their hometowns, and that could be great. And so that sort of worked.
Mhm.
And then it just started to sort of expand from there. Then we started hiring other roles, and then we hired folks on our executive team, and before long, um, more than half the company, I think by the end, by the acquisition, it's not really the end, but by the time we were acquired, I think it was about three-quarters of people were remote. All levels, all functions, managers, individual contributors, executives, leaders, everything. And, we had to won't ramble too much, but we had to change a lot and kind of figure a lot of things out because there weren't a lot of documented best practices on doing remote work. But we sort of iterated
Yeah.
our way through it and settled into
Mhm.
a pretty good rhythm with it, and it ended up being great. We were able to hire really great people, retain them for a long time. We had a great team, great culture. It was really effective for us.
Yeah. Yeah. I think if you kind of from the get go are building a remote team, things can go a lot easier. I think a lot of people were thrust into a remote
Mhm,
environment with the pandemic,
mhm.
and they just kind of adapted the way that they were working in an office environment where
Yeah,
everyone was co-located to a remote setting.
yeah,
And I think it kind of created, all sorts of problems. Are you seeing kind of the same thing as you
yeah,
talk to other leaders, and like what kinds of problems are you seeing crop up
definitely.
as a result of that?
I think there's 2 contributing factors. One is exactly what you said, which is pandemic happened overnight, offices closed their doors, and people had to work from home, and people hadn't done that before. There weren't rituals or processes around that, so companies mostly just did what they had done, which is synchronous communication, Zoom meetings, chat, you know, Slack and Teams and that sort of stuff. I
Hmm.
think that was one part of it. I think there was sort of a contributing factor there, which is for people who had not done remote work before. And when I say people, I mean really managers and leaders, probably for the most part, had not done remote work before, and maybe didn't really believe in it or trust it, but kind of had to do it. There was like a distrust of people that came along with that, and so there was this thing of like, if I can't see people, I don't know if they're working. How do I know if people are doing things and working? Which, to be honest, in my experience, rarely an issue. But I think people perceive that that will be an issue, and that leads to this, like, micromanagement style, like, "Oh, we have to communicate, I have to know what everybody's up to all the time." And then it's just,
Mm.
like, even more meetings, even more communications and check-ins and that kinda stuff, and it becomes very overwhelming and overloaded quickly.
Gotcha. Okay. Yes. I mean, to that end, would you say there's something like fundamentally different about remote work that didn't exist when we were kind of all co-located?
I think we've all gotten used to the tools, right? Like, it's not weird to video chat anymore. I mean, I do it,
Right.
like, daily, and, like, on the weekends, I, like, FaceTime with family, it's, like, part of our lives now in a way that it wasn't, 5 and 10 years ago, so I think we're all more comfortable with, and I think it's not brand new anymore, so there's many, many examples of companies who have done it and done it well and been successful, so I think that, there's just more evidence that it can work is another thing that's making people more comfortable with it, and then I think the last part is that a lot of people, like employees, prefer it. And so while
Yes.
companies may want to go back and go back to a fully in-person environment, a lot of employees don't want to do that. And as in an effort to retain some of the best people, sometimes you have to cater to that a little bit.
Yeah. It feels like though, I don't know, like for the people who have just gone to remote with the same kind of synchronous practices, there's
Hmm.
almost like an elevated sense of, on one hand, people self-report that they prefer that.
Yeah.
But also, it feels like there's, like, almost like an increase in, like, burnout
Yeah, for sure.
around work, or
Yeah.
just, like, they like remote work. They like the freedom that remote work allows,
Mhm.
but it's like a increased, like, burnout, or increased, like, I don't know. They feel like they're interrupted too often.
Yeah.
They're too frequently context switching. Yeah, talk to me. Have you seen kind of the same thing? Like, how do you think
Yeah.
about it?
Yeah. So I think there's two things, and I should have said this earlier. Like, I think another thing to point out, and I try to remind people of this as often as possible, is the pandemic version of remote work is not real remote work or good remote work, right? And luckily, we've just kind of
Yes.
come out of this at this point for the most part. But that period of time where people weren't leaving their houses and kids weren't going to school and whatever, it was just that kind of very extreme version of remote work was
Mhm.
not representative of real remote work, right? Like in a, like today, and hopefully, and well into the future, we can go out in the middle of the day, and other people will go to school or do other things, and it's a different kind of vibe. So I
Yes.
will say, for people who had that initial impression where remote work is very overwhelming and tons of interruptions, I think part of it was that pandemic version of remote work. But
Got it.
beyond
Okay.
that, even
Yeah.
beyond that, I do
Mhm.
think the way that you communicate and the way that, so there's two sides, but there's like the company side and there's the individual side. On the company side, I think there's rituals and kind of processes that should change to embrace remote work and really get the most out of it. And the sort of the version that we're leaning towards, and a lot of people are, is the more asynchronous version of it. We could talk more about that in a minute. But also on the personal side, I do think you have to be, it benefits you to be more structured in your day because the lines between, I'm at home and I'm at work are basically completely blurred. And so you can kind of be always on. It's easy to get distracted. It's easy to let work just sort of consume all of your day, even if you're not really giving it your full attention. You're kind of in this like half working state all day, which is sort of
Yes.
overwhelming and ineffective at the same time. So I
Yes.
think putting some personal boundaries and some structure around your day and your schedule is important to really getting the best out of remote work.
Okay. Yes. Okay. I want to dive into that exactly in a sec. But first, just for definition's sake, there's remote work and then there's asynchronous work.
Yeah.
And can you give some like verbiage to those? Like how
Yeah.
would you kind of define the differences between the two?
Yeah, these are very broad terms and different people mean different things when they say them, and there's different versions of it, right? People say remote
Mhm.
work, distributed work, virtual first. There's a whole bunch of different versions of that. And to some people, it means you never go into an office. Sometimes there's an office that some people go into, but other people don't. Sometimes it's like 3 days in the office per week and 2 days at home. There's all different versions, but the sort of overarching category of remote work to me has to do with place. It's like, where do you do your work, right? Do
Yes.
you go into an office or do you go into a centralized place or not? When I think of async work, it's about time. So it's like, are we all working at the same
Mm,
time? Is it, 9 a.m. to 5 a.m. or 5 p.m. Eastern? I'm in Eastern time,
mhm.
or is there more blurred lines there? And I think the most extreme version of that is it doesn't matter when you're doing your work and you actually don't even think about really the time that it takes to do your work. You're not tracking hours or anything like that. You're more focused on the outputs, or sorry, the outcomes and the results that you're getting. And it doesn't matter if I'm working now or I choose to work at night or, I have to go out in the middle of the day. So I'm going to, shift my schedule today. So anyway, remote work, I think of as remote. I think of as about the place you work, and async, I think of as the time that you work.
Yes. Okay. Okay. You were just talking kind of before that about a shift in practices to like better embrace remote work.
Yeah.
Um, and you and your team have written a lot about some of the problems of
Yeah.
just switching to remote, and
Yeah.
you actually recommend this different way of working and communicating. Tell
Yeah.
me a bit more about that.
I think one of the challenges that we had initially with remote work, and again, we were as a company that had a New York office and everybody was in the office, and we sort of transitioned to remote work. This was well before the pandemic, but I think
Hmm.
people who are coming out of the pandemic are in a similar situation in a lot of cases. Was if you sort of just put the remote people up on a TV on the wall and you do everything else the same way that you would in the office normally, it really creates kind of a second class experience for those remote people. It's much harder to hear what's going on. It's harder to contribute. It's just harder to be a part of it. And a lot gets missed as a result. So that's sort of like for synchronous things like meetings. Our policy was if there was one remote person in a meeting, then everybody took the meeting from, their laptops and there should be one face per box in, Zoom or whatever app you're using was our policy. Beyond that, communication tends to happen sort of through osmosis or ambiently in an office, right? Like you walk past somebody, you tap them on the shoulder, you ask a
Yes.
question, you answer it. That doesn't translate very well when you have a remote, well, sort of a hybrid environment where there's some people in the office and people not, because there just becomes this information imbalance where the remote people can't do that and don't get the benefit of hearing that stuff. So there needs to be a culture of sort of documentation and information sharing to
Mm,
communicate that information as well. And then lastly, like I also think the morale piece and the cultural piece is important. Some of that kind of comes, I don't want to say for free, but maybe more easily in an in-person environment because you're hanging out with people. You can, I don't know, you can bring donuts in the morning or, do something pretty low effort like that. And you kind of get people to congregate and you have a little fun and a little moment and you do a little
yeah.
bonding, or you can go out to dinner or drinks after work or whatever. Again, that's much harder, and the equivalents to those don't work well in the remote environment, right? Like, if the
Right.
remote happy hour, I'm sure we've all done them at this point, like, they're pretty terrible, and so finding other ways to kind of engage the pe everybody and kind of help to build relationships and build empathy between teammates because that goes a long way, right? When you have a relationship with people and you have an understanding of them and what makes them tick, then when you're working with them on a project, especially if that project gets difficult for some reason, like, it's a much better working relationship with those people. So you need to find ways to replicate that. And to be honest, I think one of the ways is literally getting together in person periodically.
Mhm.
That goes a long way. It's not always possible, but when you can do it, it goes a long way.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, you talked about a lot of the kind of, yeah, morale, the culture stuff. Tell me tell me more about kind of the, like, specific seems like a big change for people who are kind of used to working in a more synchronous way now,
Hmm.
moving towards a more asynchronous way of working.
Yeah.
Talk to me more about, like, what are the specific, like, workflows of communication and decision making, kind of
Yeah.
all of that that they should be thinking about adopting,
Yeah.
and how do you even do that? Seems like we all have so much momentum. It's, we're these big ships of we've all kind of been working
Mhm.
this way for a long time. How do you even start to change direction there?
Yeah, I think that one of the keys for async work, and we've really been doing it in earnest for the last, I don't know, 8 or 9 months, I guess it's been, is just being a lot more intentional with your time and what you're going to do with that time. You have to think ahead about it because let's say I sit down, I'm like, okay, I'm going to work on a project this afternoon. I sit down to work on that project and I'm like, oh shoot, I'm missing something. Like I don't know this piece, or I forgot to ask where this document is or whatever. If you're
Hmm.
really working asynchronously, like the whole point is that you can't just interrupt somebody, right? Like if you were working synchronously, maybe you're in a Zoom and you just ask somebody, or you're in Slack and you just ping them a quick message and you're back from them. But when you're async, like you can't do that, right? They might be in a very different time zone, or they might not be working at that moment. So
Yeah,
even if you do have that question, you're not going to get a quick answer. So you really have to think ahead and say, what is the sort of context and the information that I need to do this task? Where I need information from other people, like I need to be specific about what I need and kind of get that ahead of time and communicate that to them ahead of time so that you
yeah,
can make the most of those async sort of opportunities. And I think the other thing is kind of having a couple parallel streams going so that if you do get blocked on something for some reason, because there are
yeah,
legitimate reasons where something comes up and you need somebody else's input or a decision or something, that you have another thing to switch to so you don't get blocked and there's kind of nothing you can do to make progress.
yes, yes, yeah. Sounds like okay. Yeah, I mean, one of the big things I'm hearing there, or one of the big things that's coming to mind is, man, we really need to have, I mean, the whole way we work almost kind of documented
Hmm.
such that anyone can kind of go, anyone can go to this reference book
Yeah.
and there's almost instructions for here's how we make decisions. Here's
Yeah.
the status of all the projects in flight. Here's kind of what everyone's working on, where it's at.
Yeah.
Um, are you have you guys taken a large effort with Hoop to kind of do that yourselves? Like how should we people who haven't kind of set the groundwork for this kind of how should we think about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, we've started to communicate a little bit about how we do it. We certainly haven't created like a handbook yet, but
Mm,
maybe. And there is other information out there. Like remote.com has a lot of good information on this. GitLab has a lot of
mhm.
good information. There's a bunch of stuff out there. And we're learning all the time. We collectively as people are learning all the time, better ways to do this. And we certainly plan to share what we learn. I think two things are clear to me. One, people are hungry for this information. Like as we've started to post, write blog posts and we have a
Mm,
newsletter and we post things on LinkedIn and stuff like that. Like we've gotten a lot of energy back from people who are really unhappy with this kind of status quo of their work right now, and also really want to understand what they can do with their teams and at their companies to work better and not be so synchronous, not be so reactive and always on, but be more thoughtful and more time for more deep creative work. So that's exciting to me. I feel like there's a lot of energy and enthusiasm in this space as we try to figure out how we can play a role there. The other thing is that oftentimes the async practices play really well in even more synchronous environments. I mean, we saw the same thing at Trello where like some of the remote practices that we learned actually made non-remote work better too. One example here, as we were doing some early kind of customer development and customer research for Hoop, as we were trying to figure out what we were doing, one of the behaviors that we noticed, we talked to like, I don't know, over 200 knowledge workers. One of the things that was common to almost everybody was this pattern of I did some kind of creative work. Maybe I like wrote a draft of a blog post or a strategy document, or I designed a, UX user flow, whatever it might be.
mhm.
And now I want to show that to a few people and get their thoughts on it. And what most people do is they would go to Slack and they would send a link to whatever the thing is. And they say like, hey, can you look at this when you get a second and tell me what you think? And that's such a low information way to kind of communicate that request. And what ends up happening is there's a lot of back and forths. So usually people are busy. They don't get to that thing right away. So you end up going back to Slack and being like, hey, think you have time this week to look at this thing? And you kind of have to nag them and nudge them a million times to get them to actually look at it. And
Mhm.
then once they look at it, you haven't really been clear with, what you actually want from them and what kind of feedback you might want. And so, they don't know, let's say it was a blog post. They don't know if you're looking for like broad overarching, like, is this even the right thing to talk about, or are there better topics to talk about, or are you looking for like a spelling and punctuation review, and it's almost done.
Hmm.
So I think being really clear when you're sort of communicating with people about, you know, when kind of the time frame of like when you need help, how urgent it is and how important it is, and then being specific of like what you actually need from them is really, really helpful. And that works better and makes things faster, even synchronously, because you don't have to go back and forth on like trying to clarify the request. You just kind of front load that with all the context you need. And it makes it much easier for that person to prioritize that among their, already busy schedule and give you the information that you need more quickly without, going back and forth 5 times.
Yes. So yeah, how do you recommend people kind of do a better job of that now? Is that literally sending someone an email or pinging someone on Slack and including more of that context in the ask about
Yeah.
this is the hey, here's the thing, here's the level of feedback I'm looking for,
Yeah.
here's the time frame I'm looking for it in. Like
Yeah.
how should we think about doing that?
Yeah, so I think that's a great way to start. Like, I think that's definitely like the a big first step. So a couple examples for what we do. Like if I've ever recently I was working on a new feature for when I wanted to show it to Brian and Stella and get some feedback from them. I made a loon and I kind of walked through it and I kind of described what it was and kind of why I made it and that sort of stuff. And then we've been using Twist, which I don't know if anybody's used that, but it's a product by Doist. It's sort of for longer form, more asynchronous communication. So instead of posting in Slack, which kind of it all scrolls up out of the way and gets lost, we put it in Twist. And then I kind of have this check for myself where before I post it, I'm like, all right, have I been clear? And I always try to ask like 2, 3 questions specific.
Mhm.
You know, do you think that this helps us get to our goal of blah, 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 blah? Or, try and ask more specific questions rather than just saying like, what do you think? Like try to give
Mm,
people really specific things to weigh in on. I found that when people do that to me, when I'm answering the questions, it's much easier for me to give feedback because instead of kind of looking at this blog post and trying to think of something smart and useful to say, I'm like, okay, they need 3 pieces of information from me. I'll give them my sort of thoughts on those and then I'm done. I know I'm done, right? Like that's what they asked for. I gave them what they asked for. Great. We can move on. Another version of this, Stella does a lot of our writing for letter and blog posts and things. She usually shares them 3 times before she posts them. The first one, she'll do a very quick draft and she'll put in like the title, like 30% feedback needed. And that's like the very high level, like, is this even a topic worth sharing about? Is there something meaty? Do we have like an interesting opinion or anything to share on that? Then
mhm.
there's kind of the 60% level, which is a little beyond that. It's more, is the structure well? Are the points clear? Kind of is it's starting to become more final. And then there's the 90% feedback, which is like, is the punctuation correct? Do all the links work?
Right.
Are the image captions correct? Like the very detailed, like this is about to go live kind of stuff. And again, that's just much easier and more useful to provide feedback on because she's been clear about kind of what level of feedback she's looking at. And as somebody helping her out, it's much easier to do that. So I think like that's a great way to start for companies that are looking to make this transition. I think it's really about front loading that context and really sharing the context ahead of time.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. Yep, that makes sense for getting feedback. It feels like another one of the big offenders here for like the constant need for more meetings, for more
Mhm.
interrupts is around making big decisions.
Yeah.
That was a ton of great tips for how to kind of better get feedback. Any tips for kind of how to better make decisions
Yeah.
in that way?
Yeah, it's funny. This is our wheelhouse and what we've been researching and
Yeah,
learning so much about over the last few months. What's interesting about decision making is like our intuitions as humans is usually like, all right, we got to make a decision. Let's get a bunch of people together. We'll talk it through and we'll figure it out. And it turns out, like, if you look at the research around decision making, that's just about the worst way possible to make decisions because
really.
it's full of bias, leads to tons of groupthink. Generally, the person who's in a position of authority, whether it's like the management or the leader or whatever, their opinion just carries more weight just because that's how we are as humans who work in hierarchical organizations. Other times it's like the loudest person or the most extroverted person, the person who states their opinion the strongest kind of carries more weight than, somebody who might be a little more quiet or a little more thoughtful. And then there's just like different sort of speeds of thinking. Some people are like very reactive and they just say whatever comes to their mouth, comes to their head, comes out of their mouth. Other people are more thoughtful and they have to deliberate and think and kind of chew on it a little bit before they have a thoughtful opinion. So it turns out that's what most people do, and that's actually one of the worst ways to make decisions. I think just as a best practice, really writing down the decision first. Like, here's the decision we need to make. Here's why it's an important decision that we make it now. Here's the time frame that we need to make this decision. Right, we got to make it this week or by the end of the month or whatever it is. Here's sort of here are the people that are important to contribute to this decision. and then doing some form of like, here's the different options. Ideally, you should have, I think, an opinion there. Like, I think we should do X, but also we could do Y and Z. And here's
Mhm.
sort of like the trade-offs between those things. And then having a discussion about it. Ideally, when you're having that, and when I say discussion, I mean asynchronously, so in writing and comments. Ideally, when you're having that discussion, this is something we've built into the alpha version of our product. Um, you cannot see other people's comments until you yourself have given your feedback, because that in that way you reduce the bias and the groupthink that comes from like somebody makes a comment and people kind of pile on that, or somebody else comes and they sort of are influenced by seeing that before they've really formulated their opinion. And so, if you've done that, if you've collected opinions sort of without the groupthink, then you can sort of assess like, okay, where are the differences of opinions? And if it's a big decision that maybe you might need to get people together, it's not like all meetings are bad. It's okay to have a meeting. Um, then you can really focus in on, where are the areas of disagreement, or, where are the things where we have like different opinions? Because generally what that means is somebody just has some piece of information that somebody else doesn't have, or they're
Mm.
weighting that information differently than somebody else is. So you can talk about that and you can say, okay, I didn't think about that, or I did think about that, but I didn't think that was important because whatever.
Mhm.
And you can really focus in on that. We had an example recently where we did this. We were trying to pick a branding firm to work with, of all things, and we had some four different options. And there was things like price, the packaging, the timing, their past work, et cetera, a bunch of different facets to it. We set aside an hour to meet on it, but we used our product this time to kind of lay out the decision and weigh on it beforehand, and we were able to finish that meeting in like 15 minutes because we got in there and there was like clearly it was down to two options and there was kind of a difference of opinion there. We talked through that quickly and we were good to go. So I think really getting that information ahead of time and sort of working through it, not in real time, helps you focus the meeting time if you even need it at all, and
Yes.
ends up in sort of much faster decisions and better decisions because now you've gotten more opinions in there. You've gotten people to sort of given them time to kind of work through their thoughts and come up with a more thoughtful, less reactive sort of idea on that decision. And so I think that's a much better way to do it than doing what most people tend to do, and I'm guilty of in the past as well, is getting a bunch of people in the room and trying to reach consensus.
Yeah. Yeah, the more I think about it, the more I feel like that's often the thing I reach to first, like, uh, I don't know if it's just out of laziness, but honestly, it feels like that's like the easy it feels like that's the easy thing to do.
Mhm.
It's, I had a thought, I had a question. Let me go let me go grab everyone and kind of
Mhm.
interrupt them.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what they're in the middle of doing. Let me go grab them and
Yeah.
see what everyone else thinks.
Exactly.
Uh,
I think that's one of the keys with synchronous work too. What you need to consider is when you're pinging somebody and you're saying like, "Hey, let's talk about this," or "Here's a question I have." You're focusing their attention on whatever that thing is, that project, that task, that question, whatever it is, which means their attention is not focused on anything else that it could be focused on, which might be other, important projects, tasks, whatever. So
right.
there's this trade-off of like attention that is happening. And often it's when you're not thoughtful or intentional about where you're making those trade-offs, you're often making bad trade-offs, right? Like somebody's attention gets shifted to something less important or less impactful than what they could be working on just because you're sort of reacting in real time and kind of
Mhm.
going to whatever's in front of you.
Yeah.
And so one of the benefits of async work is you can really be thoughtful about like what is the most important thing I could be doing right now, and really actually getting to spend some solid time working on that, being creative, thoughtful, going deep on whatever that challenge is that you have.
Right. Sounds like the majority of what you're describing was just around, let's be more intentional about putting our thoughts down in kind of like a long form written way
Hmm.
ahead of time.
Hmm.
Um, any other things come to mind as you think about kind of async decision making?
Yeah, I mean, there's like some sort of cultural things that need to come along with that, right? Like there needs to be a shift in expectations, right? Like I've talked to so
Mm,
many people who work in more traditional synchronous environments, and there's an expectation of like responses to Slack messages and emails that you'll respond like immediately, at all times, at all hours, right? And if you're working asynchronously, you can't have that expectation and also expect people to work asynchronously. Those two things are at odds. You
right.
can still have some kind of like an SLA on timing. Like we try to say, like 24 hours ish to respond to something. Sometimes it could be 48, but you need to shift that expectation. You need to understand, like if you put something out there, it doesn't mean that people are going to drop everything and look at that right now. They're going to probably finish what they're working on and then prioritize that thing against, whatever else is in front of them. So there are some cultural shifts that need to take place to make that possible.
Yeah, it kind of feels, man, it almost kind of feels like switching from, hey, we use cars generally for
Mhm.
transportation and we want to switch to using railroads. It's almost like there's this whole communication and workflow, like infrastructure that needs to exist for this change to take,
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
yeah,
Like I could
definitely.
see it. You can't just like switch overnight. And it seems
Yeah,
like a lot of those cultural kind of leadership like expectations need to come from leadership first and
yeah,
foremost.
yeah, yeah.
What kinds of problems would you foresee people running into as they try to switch to this way of working, or like how do you think it might feel for them? Like what things are going to come up for them?
I think it feels foreign at first. I think that's one of the hard parts, right? It feels different, and it can feel like I even find this with myself. Like sometimes I get sucked into my email inbox or Slack, looking through Slack or whatever else when I'm like, you know what, like I don't need to respond to this right now. It's just sort of, I don't know, I'm just used to like checking that stuff all the time. So I have to remind myself that
Yeah.
for personally, I set aside my lunchtime to like do that. I eat and then I quickly look through those notifications. So some of that is just giving people a chance to absorb that change and kind of process it.
Hmm.
I think the other thing is kind of falling back into old habits in a collaborative way. So one of the challenges with a tool like Slack, and I like Slack overall, we use it. It's a good tool, but I think in many cases it's overused and it becomes a little bit of a source of stress as a result because it's just there's constantly stuff happening in there. So
Hmm.
one of the challenges with that is when important discussions or decisions happen in Slack in a synchronous way, people who weren't there for that feel like they missed out, right? Maybe I had a thought on this and I didn't have time to chime in because the discussion just rolled on and I wasn't there. And so I didn't get to participate in that. So that sort of reinforces this idea like I need to be checking Slack all the time so I don't miss the next important discussion or decision and have a chance to chime in on that. So when you try to shift to asynchronous, there's this sense of like, you know what, this time I just want to get this done quick. So I'm just gonna like do this in Slack and pull everybody in real quick. But that starts to chip away at the sort of psychological safety that you've built up through this asynchronous thing, and that's sort then people are like, "Well, I kinda do have to check Slack because then I missed that one time that there was a thing in there." So I think it's like being a little bit rigid with your process and trying to really remind people that, like, that's not how you're trying to do things, and there's this other way to do things, and there's a lot of benefits to that other way of doing things. Because I think I still find myself we were talking about pulling everybody into a meeting to decide something, like, I sort of go to that sometimes. It's just, like, almost reflex. It's, like, how I've done things for a long time. So, continuing to remind ourselves and each other that, like, there's other more asynchronous ways to do this that they're gonna be just as good and just as effective, but we have to remember to do them.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. One thing I keep coming back to is just being more thoughtful and intentional and
Mhm.
almost thinking more like long term about the work you're doing. Like
Yeah.
it's easy. It's like a dopamine hit to get that kind of quick fix now.
Yeah.
But like, is this like better, as a whole, like for the whole company,
Yeah.
you know?
And honestly,
Okay.
I think a lot of people are frustrated that they don't have time to spend on, like, real work. I've heard people use that term a lot of times, and
Hmm.
what that means is different depending on what your role is. If you're an
Hmm.
engineer, it might be writing code. If you're a designer, it's in there thinking about, designing flows or whatever else. Product manager might be, writing a strategy document or something like that. A lot of people feel like they don't have time for that. They try to squeeze that in between, meetings or, after hours because that's the only time they don't have meetings, and that's really frustrating for people because they feel like they're not able to work on it when they have their best, their most energy, and they're not able to spend as much time on it as they would like to. So, I think that's really one of the benefits, and we have to remember that, like, what we're trying to do is protect people's time for that more deep, thoughtful, creative work
Yes.
that is really, like that's like when you're building a company, you're trying to hire smart people and, have them do great work to help your company succeed. Being in a million meetings all day, especially meetings with, like, 20 people in them, is not a good use of their time.
Hmm.
And really, like, reminding everybody that, like, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to protect our time to spend on, really important work and be able to go deep on that and do great work as a result. I think most that resonates with most people and, tends to help people remember why we're doing it this way and think ahead about how they can work better in that way.
Yes. Yes. The constant Slack message barrage kind of,
Mhm,
it's a lot of activity. It's like a lot of busyness,
mhm.
but is, yeah, often not like actual progress for the company.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Going to jump into questions now from the audience. Blake's going to actually push some questions to the screen. I'll read them out and you can answer them. So, what are your top three most tools for async communications across teams?
That's a good question. I don't have a good sense for, I haven't done like an official survey across teams, but I think that when we've spoken to people, the tools that we hear about a lot and the tools that we use ourselves, three that I can think of are Loom is a good one, right?
Hmm.
So async video. So it's almost like a Zoom. You record your screen and you record your yourself, your face, your voice at least, and you can share that with people. So that's really good. Definitely recommend it. Just some kind of there's a bunch of versions out of this. We use Notion for documentation and organization of documents. I've seen people use Confluence, which we used a lot of last year, obviously. You could kind of use Google Docs for this too. And there's some other things, but some kind of like a place where you put written work that people can see and comment on or collaboratively edit. I'm trying to think like what else. There's there's a bunch that are sort of in there and around project management and things like that. I already mentioned this once, so I'll just mention it again. Like we use Twist for asynchronous communication, kind of
Hmm.
Slack like, but much longer form. It's
Yeah.
not as immediate. And it's a pretty simple tool. Like it's not, there's nothing crazy about it, but
Hmm.
I like it for two reasons. One, it tends to be longer form. It encourages longer form kind of writing. It's not like super long, not like 5 pages, but like two paragraphs instead of, one sentence. But also it has this inbox concept. So you sort of like mark things. It's not like you're going channel by channel and like reading up the
Hmm.
history. There's this
Yes.
inbox concept where it's like there's a couple things that need your attention. You go through, you respond, or just note that you've seen it, mark it as done, and then it's out of your way. So I like that kind of workflow is much more directed to the person and what they need to get done rather than just Slack feels like this big giant inbox of like everything and you can kind of
Yeah.
just browse around and see whatever and overwhelming and distracting as a result.
Yeah. I heard someone describe it as like this endless receipt that just keeps printing, that you just kind of have to like, you got to just keep reading through the whole thing to find like,
Mhm,
oh, is there something on here that I like have to be aware of?
mhm.
Yeah. It's exhausting.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
exactly.
cool. Okay. I think Blake's got a couple more. I'm one of the founders of a travel company and lead product. We're fully remote. As a seasoned product leader, how do you collaborate with teams across various time zones, especially if you're 10 to 12 hours apart?
That's hard. That's really hard. I can tell you what we did at Trello was we had overlap hours, which does not really help with your 10 to 12-hour situation here. So
Right.
we had at Trello, we had noon to 4 New York time was our overlap hours. So regardless of what time zone people were in, like they had to work those hours. And that was useful because you could get your sort of synchronous time done then and then other different people were working different times past that. Um, I think if you're working 10 to 12 hours apart, that's really, really hard because either people are up really late at night or really early in the morning. I would lean on a lot of written communication and looms back and forth probably. And then I think this is tough. I think you just need to be really clear about, what are the sort of like priorities. Like, what are we trying to get this done this week? What are the things that sort of funnel up into that priority? Have some way, whether it's a project management tool or some kind of tool like Notion to go back and forth on those things and comment and clarify them. But that's tough. I think just trying to front load a lot of context and communication is going to be the key there.
Yeah. One follow up that I had was around certainly, I don't think anyone's advocating that like everyone should be 100% asynchronous. You should
No,
never have to hop into a meeting.
right.
When are the appropriate times? Or like, yeah, when is the situation appropriate? Or at what, stage of a project
Hmm.
does it make sense that like, okay, we're going to get together
Yeah.
and talk about this?
Yeah. So what we've said for ourselves at Hoop is we try to do 80% asynchronous, 20% synchronous. So we have 2 hours per day where we call them overlap hours, and
Hmm.
it's not like they're always all meetings, but if you wanna have a meeting, if you wanna talk to somebody, like, that's the time to do it. I think if you're gonna have a meeting, it's important you sort of have a good meeting. So, the basics of, like, having an agenda and preparing if there's a pre-read or some kinda thing like that,
Hmm.
getting that out to people, not, like, 30 minutes before the meeting when they're probably busy doing something else and don't have time to do the pre-read, but,
Yeah.
like, a day before the meeting or something where they actually can have time to read the thing ahead of time.
Hmm.
And then I think it's about, you know, what do you wanna do? What are you gonna do in that meeting? So, I think communicating about projects and kind of working through problems is good. I think status updates are not great for meetings, like, those can really be done asynchronously. There's a million tools to do that. Brainstorming is notoriously bad doing meetings for the same reason as decision making. A lot of bias and groupthink that comes out of that. There's all kinds of research that shows that it's much better to brainstorm independently and then come together to share the results. We already talked about decision making and trying to reach consensus in a meeting is bad. So I think those more like collaborative, kind of like working through a problem, gaining understanding, sharing context can be a good use of a meeting if there's a good agenda to it. But I do think synchronous time is important. I think it's important to see people's faces and hear people's voices. It helps to build empathy with those people so that when you are working asynchronously, you can sort of hear things through their voice and kind of understand where they're coming from more. I think it helps with that kind of communication. So there are companies that try to do like 100% async and they have people in every time zone in the world and people rarely meet. I think that personally, this is just me. Some people may love that. I think that would be challenging and I think I would miss, talking to people and seeing people.
Yeah. Sounds like you're saying times where there just has to be a lot of quick kind of back and forth.
Yeah.
So it's that we've all spent a while putting our thoughts on paper. Now let's kind of quickly
Yep.
discuss, the merits
Yep.
of each one of them, or we're at the end of the project and we just need to do like 100 iterations of tweak this, see how it looks, tweak this, see how it looks.
Yeah.
Kind of
Yeah.
that back.
Getting the thoughts down ahead of time and then coming into the meeting to discuss either where they're different or, where there's, some arguments or whatever is like really a good use of time. Kind of coming together and just meandering around is not a good use of time.
Yep. Okay. I think we got time for maybe one or two more. If Blake, you want to throw another one up there? Cool. Connor asks, it seems that people somehow lose some humanity when working remote, perhaps more negative, more defensive, more harsh with each other. As all communication is on Slack and Teams, people tend to hide behind our keyboards. Have you come across that and how do you deal with that?
So I haven't personally come across that in my working environment, but I've definitely heard people say that. And I think I've seen that in like internet communities and things like that, where it can tend to be a little bit dehumanizing to just only talk to like a avatar on a screen, not ever see or hear somebody. That's why I kind of like the 80% async, 20% synchronous. I think it's really helpful and important to, see the other person's face, see their facial expressions, hear their voice. You can just pick up a lot about, how their day is going, what kind of mood they're in, what kind of personality they have. That carries through to, async communication. So that's how we've dealt with it. And I think even on, we at Hoop, we've tried to get together in person every like 3-4 months, just for like 2 days.
Yeah.
But that goes a long way too, doing some work together, but then also, going out and having dinner or something is a nice way to just build those relationships. And what we've seen is that kind of the energy and the enthusiasm that you can build in one of those in-person get-togethers, that'll carry us for like 3-4 months until the next
Mhm.
one. So it's not like you have to do it too often. And I know it gets harder with more people across more time zones and with more, different things going on in life. But I do feel like some person to person connection, at least virtually and ideally occasionally in person, is important to building those relationships and having those effective kind of working collaborations.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think that, at least once, probably twice a year of like getting the whole company together, getting some FaceTime is just
Hmm.
so important.
Hmm.
Meeting people and having those shared experiences, just kind of doing fun stuff in real life, even if it's just like, hey, we got a couple Airbnbs, we're all gonna, play some lawn games and play
Yeah,
some board games and cook dinner together. Like,
exactly.
yeah, kind of invaluable time. All right. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. So wanted to say thanks so much for doing this. As a reminder, these events are put on by the Launch Awesome community. Blake's going to drop a link in the chat one more time. If you want to join, you can hear about future events and we'd love to see you in the community. So Justin, thanks again for being here. Where can folks find you and connect?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me. It was great to be here, Steve. Appreciate it. Yeah, if you're interested in this async stuff, follow along with us at hoop.app. We
Mhm.
have an alpha out if anybody's interested in trying it, and we're always looking to talk to people who are doing this or interested in learning more about this to figure out how we can help bring about this change in the world and help more people work remotely and asynchronously. So check us out.
Cool deal. All righty. Well, thanks everyone for coming. And thanks again, Justin. And we'll see y'all.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everybody.